Hey there, Dr. Mark here, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how to nutrition coach wheelchair athletes. Like other forms of athletics, nutrition is very important for these athletes, for their recovery, for their performance, and to improve body composition. But not much is commonly known on how to adapt nutrition recommendations to these athletes, especially when physical measurements like body weight and height are hard to measure or inaccessible. Therefore, good information can be hard to find. But I've done some research and I want to present what is known and do my best to fill in any gaps with best guesses and my own recommendations. So if you've ever worked with wheelchair athletes or are interested in serving this growing community, this video is for you. So let's dive in. So super brief background first. Wheelchair sports are athletic events for people that use wheelchairs. This is most common for spinal cord injuries, but also a whole range of physical disabilities and impairments like amputations or spina bifida. And here's the most important part for nutrition coaches. We do have specific recommendations for nutrition in sport, but these are for able-bodied athletes without much recommendations or research for wheelchair sport, which can be problematic because there are differences between these athletes, namely because of differences in things like energy expenditure. There's a lot of different effort that goes into moving a wheelchair, but also different working muscles and the differences between upper body and lower body muscles, as well as the digestion of food and motility and movement through the gut due to different positioning. Plus, I really want you to think about individual requirements for a second. Most of the calculations we use to determine energy requirements and macronutrient intake include variables like height and weight and body composition and activity level. These may be wildly inaccurate in the context of wheelchair athletes. And in some cases, which we're going to talk about today, you might not even have insight into what those variables are, which is why today I'm going to present some best practices on how to nutrition coach wheelchair athletes. And you need to make sure to stick around till the end of the video where I'm going to give some practical suggestions on how to work with any type of wheelchair athlete. This is a very important and underserved community of athletes, and most importantly, growing body of sport, which means plenty of business opportunities for nutrition coaches. The most popular wheelchair sport globally is going to be wheelchair basketball, but there's also tennis, rugby, and racing, which is like athletics, and power football, among a bunch of other sports. And there's currently 22 wheelchair sports in the Paralympics. And the popularity of adaptive sports isn't just growing at the highest level, it's also growing at the community or grassroots level. The rules and regulations of wheelchair sports are altered from the traditional sports to accommodate the athletes, like different sizes of equipment, for example. Now, the benefits of exercise are well established for everyone, disabled or not, because it does reduce the risk of chronic disease. And although most people don't achieve activity guidelines, people with spinal cord injuries are particularly inactive. So inclusion in sport is vital for this population. Outside of the physical benefits, wheelchair sports also increase confidence and a sense of community. I've seen this firsthand, having a personal interest in the area of powerlifting and seeing the inclusion of the Paralympic bench press or para bench press and the popularity completely explode. But growing sports need growing support, so let's talk about how nutrition fits into all of this. Here's what I was somewhat shocked to find out, and this is my ignorance in all this, so bear with me. Last week I was having a conversation with a relatively new nutrition coach, and we were talking about ways to grow his business, namely what he could do to be more specific with who he works with. See, in the online coaching world, the more specific you can be with who you work with the type of person and what they want to achieve, what problems that they face, and how you are best suited to help them, the easier it is to grow your business. But this coach was just getting started and he didn't want to exclude anyone from his business. So he's planning on focusing on general weight loss, which isn't a bad idea, but definitely not specific. And I also found this interesting because I looked in his profile picture and he was sitting in a wheelchair. So I had to ask, is there anything about you and your unique experience that could set you apart? And he said, well, I was a wheelchair rugby athlete for many years and I got pretty far, almost to the national level. And there it was. This is what I viewed as his superpower. So I dug a little bit deeper. When you were training for wheelchair rugby, was there much nutritional guidance and support for you? No, he said, there wasn't much support, which I totally understood, but I thought, if there's anyone that understands the problems and struggles of being a wheelchair athlete, it's got to be this guy. So I had to bring it up. Have you ever considered narrowing down your focus to these athletes? And he told me he had thought about it, but there was a lot of barriers to getting into that. And then he told me all the calculations that we routinely use to calculate things like energy expenditure and therefore calorie and macronutrient intake, he didn't really know how to approach that because, as I was somewhat shocked to find out, he didn't really know how tall he was. And he wasn't really sure of his body weight because he hadn't been back to a specialist setting to use a wheelchair scale in about 3 years. So the equations that are routinely used to set starting points for these kind of athletes are somewhat useless in this scenario. And sure, many established athletes may have access to this type of equipment, but many don't. So here's where I found myself. I have a very qualified nutrition coach sitting right in front of me that just so happened to be a former wheelchair athlete, telling me that he, of all people, really couldn't figure out how to work with wheelchair athletes. And then it hit me. So I agreed to take a look at what he was currently doing for his own nutrition for some practical and applied insight, but also dug into the research in this area. And he sort of laughed and said that would be helpful because he could also lose some weight, which I also thought was interesting because I didn't really know how many of these athletes struggled with their body weight or at least try to improve their body composition. But he told me this was a primary goal of many. If they could improve the ratio of muscle to leanness, they could move faster in their chairs. This was starting to get really interesting, so let me show you what I found. Okay, first off, I did what anyone would do and I bought the best textbook I could find. This book, Wheelchair Sport, written by Vicky Tolfree, who is by all accounts the go-to researcher in wheelchair sport, was really useful, particularly the chapter on nutrition and body composition, and here's what it presented. First off, there isn't much research in this area, but here's what wheelchair athletes should do. They should adhere to well-established sports nutrition guidelines, but take a look at individual requirements, which happens by getting a better sense of the athlete's body composition, how much energy they are burning, and individual preferences. But as we mentioned earlier, this is easier said than done because body weight bathroom scales aren't really an option here. But we'll talk more about how to tackle that later. But for the most part, dietary carbohydrates should form part of meals and post-training snacks. Now, there was reference to wheelchair athletes requiring less total carbohydrates versus able-bodied athletes due to a decrease in the amount of working muscles used during sport. How much less carbohydrate? Well, nearly 50% of total carbohydrate requirements has been shown to properly fuel wheelchair athletes due to the lower energy expenditure. So if we consider around 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate for medium duration, low intensity sports, 2 to 4 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate is probably the sweet spot for wheelchair athletes. But again, we need a rough estimate of body weight to use these recommendations. For dietary protein, just like able-bodied athletes, increased protein is helpful to support lean body mass gains, increased recovery, as well as performance. And increased amounts of dietary protein should be considered for wheelchair athletes, especially those doing resistance training. But just like carbohydrates, wheelchair athletes probably require less total amount of protein because due to differences in lower lean body mass and less muscle activity being used in sport. Now, hydration should be assessed with individualized strategies as wheelchair athletes may have different needs. Here's what I found most interesting though in reference to body composition. First off, as I mentioned earlier, body composition analysis, it helps you tailor individual requirements for diet and training, especially when trying to maintain an ideal body mass and the ratio between muscle mass and fat mass. And as you know, to maintain a balance of body mass, you need to know energy expenditure and energy coming in. And for wheelchair athletes, any additional amount of fat mass that they don't need can be detrimental to performance because extra weight from fat mass is an added load to these anti-gravity muscles, increasing the resistance and just flat out slows them down. Plus, the extra weight may increase the risk of pressure sores or soft tissue damage, making optimal body composition super important. Now, keep in mind when we think about body composition for these athletes, there's going to be a different distribution between lean body mass in the upper body and lower body, namely atrophy due to low activity in the lower limbs. And most of the power output for sport is going to be generated through upper body strength. With that being said, coaches and wheelchair athletes striving towards optimal body composition still want to know where the muscle and fat is being held, but these measurements are easier said than done. So scale weight obviously just gives us an idea of mass. And to get an accurate measurement of that in most cases, you just can't use a bathroom scale. Wheelchair athletes need specialized scales, so it's not always accessible or at least ideal to get repeated measurements. Now, to get a glimpse of where this mass is coming from between lean body mass and fat mass, we can do other types of measurements like underwater weighing, which is feasible and accurate for wheelchair athletes. But if it requires multiple immersions, not everyone's going to want to do that. Also, this equipment and trained staff is hard to find. Bioelectrical impedance analysis uses sensors and electrical currents to estimate lean body mass and fat mass. This is accessible for wheelchair athletes, especially the ones with the hand sensors, and most fitness centers do have access to this type of equipment. But these measurements, they are prone to error. To me though, even if they aren't correct, they're very useful to assess the individual and how they change through time. The best form of body composition measurement for wheelchair athletes is going to be DEXA, and measuring bone mineral density through X-ray. This is very accurate measurements, and it's also easy to cater the setup to these athletes, but you typically need access to some sort of sports science center. If you think big picture for a second, you want to measure body composition and assess it through time to see how the athlete's progressing. And it's also a good idea to have these numbers to make theoretical calculations about energy expenditure. But you may not have access to this stuff, and that's okay because I got a workaround that I think is going to be best suited for wheelchair athletes anyway. Instead of getting stuck in theoretical land, get a better sense of what they're doing right now, how they're eating, and make adjustments based on that. This way you don't always need body weight measurements or body comp results to set these targets, which is important because we don't want that being the barrier for people getting the support and help they need. How you get this nutrition information is getting them tracking what they're eating currently without changing much for 3 to 5 days. Getting a food record where you can start to assess the objective information, the calories and macronutrients coming from their food. Depending on how the client client feels and performs during this time, you can make some best guesses around maintenance energy intake and adjust and move them in the direction of optimal. When I did this assessment process with a coach who was a wheelchair athlete, I saw some really similar patterns to what I see in able-bodied clients. Not enough protein for sure and low overall calories. But instead of getting stuck about not having his body weight in the right place to start, I just made some adjustments to what he was already doing and added in more protein. This is how you do the best with what you have and coach this underserved population. It doesn't need to be perfect, but we can't wait until we have everything to help people succeed. And that's what you need to know about nutrition coaching and wheelchair athletes, so I hope I did it justice. But as great as all those tips are, if you're really serious about starting a nutrition coaching business, the next thing I'll have you do is check out this video I've linked up right here. Today we learned about nutrition recommendations for wheelchair athletes. Now you're gonna learn more about the science of gut health. So make sure to check it out now, and I'll see you in the next video.